Good morning, everyone. Good day, everyone. Happy Sunday. It is truly a blessing to be here. I'd like to thank Pastor Porter for extending the invitation, the Black History Month invitation for me to be here at the East Preston Baptist Church to present to you again, and to her team, and to all of you who are here this morning, this afternoon, to participate in this service and to hear the lecture. It is truly an honor for me and truly a blessing. As we sang Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, it's a song that moves me always. You listening to the words or reading the words of the song, you know and you realize that the author or the poet, the songwriter, was in an inspired place. Those words truly flowed from inspiration. It's a song, but it's also a prayer, don't you think? He is talking about the trials and the tribulations that his generation and the ancestors, his parents' generation faced, not only in the United States, but all over the world where Black people live and worked and struggled. And there's also an appeal in the song to us, to his generation. He was talking to them, but he was also talking to posterity, to the future. The appeal to he talks about God grant us a consciousness. I'm paraphrasing him now. So we do not be led astray or drink from the wine of the world, be drunk on the wine of the world, or eating from the flesh pot of whichever place we are, that we forget you, because you have brought us through these struggles. And indeed, we must remember. It's a magnificent song, and I urge us all to look again at those words, the appeal, the prayer, the invocation, and the gratitude that he had expressed in that song, or poem, or prayer. What I want to talk about today is leadership. Maybe because I'm organizing a leadership conference in May 21st to the 24th at Dalhousie University, May of this year. And the theme is community empowerment and Black leadership. And so I want to talk about that, how we ignite, or how we can. It's a discussion, a critical reflection, ignite Black leadership, and how we ourselves can become leaders in our communities and in our families. And Pastor Porter and I did not have this discussion. I found out from her this morning that yesterday, you had a leadership workshop forum. I'm thinking, and she didn't tell me what to talk about. So I thought, wow, this is what you call synchronicity, because we are right on point in that regard. And also, it's March, end of February, end of Black History Month. But at the same time, in February, last week, Saturday, February 21st, the world commemorated the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, or Malik Shabazz, as he named himself. It's 50 years since he was gunned down at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. And he, of course, was one of our iconic leaders. The previous month, in January, we celebrated and commemorated the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, the name we associate most with the civil rights movement in the United States and also internationally. And then next month, April 4th, we are going to again commemorate the passing of a fallen leader, because it was on April 4th that Dr. King was assassinated. And so here we are in the middle of the middle months between April and February of the assassination of these two important men in our lives and in our community. Because what they have done, the work that they have done, still echoes with us today. It's still a part of us today. We still look for them for guidance. Sometimes, you know, in Black History Month, and I'm thinking, is Dr. King the only person we can commemorate? What about the other leaders? But the fact that we tend to remember him more than any other leader points to his importance. But we need to remember the other leaders. I am going to begin by reading 2 poems, because I always like to share my poetry with people, with the audiences that I speak to. And because I also use the spoken word to investigate our history and to give honor and to give homage to our ancestors. And this one is called Negro Cemeteries. And I use the 19th century term Negro, as that's what we were called then. And you will see why I use the word. And I wrote it when I was living in Ontario, and the Priceville Cemetery, there was a cemetery that was discovered in a town called Priceville, which is about an hour and a half north of Toronto. And Priceville used to be a black town. It was founded by veterans of the War of 1812, the Colored Corps, the black soldiers, and their families. And today Priceville is not a black town. Today Priceville is a white town. If there are any black people in Priceville, then they have become white. And what is the reason for that? Why did these histories disappear? Histories can disappear, but they have a funny way of coming back, and sometimes they come back through the discovery of a cemetery. And this was what happened in Priceville. All these headstones started coming up, and when people started investigating, they're like, wow, these are some of the black pioneers who founded the area. And it led to a whole discussion, a whole exploration of the black history of that area and what happened to the pioneers. And I, reading that, looking at that, talking to some people who were involved in the digging up of these cemeteries, and I thought, well, what's going on here? You know, it's something really spiritual. As Bob Marley would say, a natural mystic is flowing through the air, because you cannot kill people's memories. Memories have a way of resurfacing. So I thought, these are all our ancestors coming back to us. And who were they? Who were they? They were preachers, they were teachers, they were farmers, they were soldiers, and they were asking us to remember them. Negro cemeteries are surfacing all over Ontario. Ancestors rolling over, bones creaking, skeletons dusting themselves off, dry bones shaking in fields of corn. A man walks on his farm, the morning after a thunderstorm. Him see broken headstone a push through. Him rub the mud off and see the inscriptions like hieroglyphics, reveal names, dates, ancestry. A cemetery in a field of corn. The local museum said is an old Negro cemetery. And all over, Negro cemeteries are surfacing, ancestors rolling over. From the fur trader, to the loyalist, to the mariner from Dominica, demanding we remember them, insisting we reveal their history. All over, ancestors are rolling over, in potato fields, appearing in fields of corn, appearing in wheat fields, they burst from the earth in green resurrection. African skeletons shaking the dust from their bones, skulls with rattling teeth, recite litanies of ancient woes, tongues spouting where none existed before, speaking in funereal language. Griots rise from their graves and recount the stories of their journeys. And the priests emerge from the storm and divine with their shells and stones. I see the drummers them coming. I hear them coming. I see the drummers them coming. Them playing the talking drum, the bata drum, the djembe, the funde, the long drum, sending electric messages across this land. And Toussaint Louverture rise from his dungeon tomb, and he prophesied blood and fire. And a woman named Dorinda sits on her tomb, a pipe clenched between her teeth, smoke curling from her lips as she recites and recites and recites the stories of her many passages, the stories of her many transformations, and all over. In Halifax, in Havana, in Edmonton, in Victoria, in Kingstown, in New York, in Manhattan, in San Diego, in Montego, in Rio de Janeiro, in Dakar. They say, give us strength, give us strength, give us strength. And we say, rise up, fallen fighters, rise up, fallen fighters, rise up, fallen fighters, rise up, 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 up. Thank you. And this last one, it's a poem of hope. It's called The Child is Alive. And it's important, as Pastor Porter said, for us to know our history, to remember our history, to teach our children. Because it's been proven, it's been documented, the research has been done, all kinds of studies have been done on this, that when we people, but especially children, students, when they are in school, they actually do better academically. Children who have a greater sense of their heritage, or a great sense of their heritage and their history and their culture, that these things produce confidence in them, and they actually do better in school. That culture and heritage and history is a great foundation from which all of us, but especially students, the young people, can spring from and learn and engage in the world, that it gives them this confidence. And so I want to see more black students in university, coming to university, at Dalhousie, at Smith. We live here, we're in the province, we want to see those kids on campus, because it's important that we produce a new generation at all times of scholars, of historians, of people who are doing the cultural work and the heritage work. Because if we don't, then we're gonna lose this. We're gonna lose our memory. Then all kind of myths are gonna spring up. And then you know what? People will come up with outright lies and say that we didn't do, or we weren't even here. I have this theory that 100 years from now, maybe even less, Michael Jackson is going to be seen as a white man. Seriously. I mean, he probably already is. If we don't keep saying, repeating, doing the work, and maybe write books and put things on CDs or the little flash drives and bury them or something, put them in a bottle. Because the forces that are arrayed against black people on this continent, in this province, in this country, the forces are vast, and they're not forces of good for the most case. And people always try to diminish the accomplishments of black people. And if we don't know, if we don't teach the youths and the others who are coming up, then what is going to happen to us and to our memory? You hear all kinds of foolishness nowadays. You know, in Toronto, I was there over Christmas, and there was a big, well, it wasn't a big controversy. It should have been a controversy, and I keep saying to people, well, what are you going to be doing about that? Because people are only talking. There's some school boards in Ontario that are deciding that the black history is too hard, and it's traumatizing the white kids, and they shouldn't teach them that. They should only teach the good aspects. And this is happening, or with there's one teacher who was teaching her kids that the internment of the Japanese in the Second World War, she basically flipped the script. She said the Japanese gave up their property and their money to the federal government, so the federal government could help in fighting the war. That's like an outright lie. But she was telling that to her student. So this is happening in our time. It's not happening 100 years in the future. It's happening now. That people feel, well, we've done this Black History Month thing, we're kind of tired of it. Let's erase that from the curriculum. Not that it's part of the curriculum anyway, but just in February. Their teachers were saying, we can't bother, it's too traumatic for the white students, because when they hear about the slavery thing, they feel guilty, and they feel that their ancestors did bad, and we don't want our children to be traumatized. So slavery is not the only topic in Black history, and so I said, well, go beyond that then. Go to Nubia, and go to Egypt and Ethiopia, and to the African continent, the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The great civilization. Teach them that if you don't want to talk about slavery. But slavery is important because it is the reason that we're all here in this church today. Like, seriously, everybody. Yeah. I say that to my classes at Dalhousie, which is predominantly white, and they kind of look at me weird. What's she talking about? Is slavery responsible for my being here? And I would say yes. Because it's the fruits from slavery. The wealth that was engendered, that was produced by these empires, by the United States and Brazil and Britain, that led these places to become so powerful that they could conquer and establish big empires and send out millions of people from Europe, the ancestors of the people in my class, to colonize Canada and Argentina and wherever else. So yes, it is because of slavery and the wealth. The free labor for close to 4 centuries that Black people and their descendants produced that led to the wealth of the world. I'm kind of going off topic, but I think it's important. Yeah. That Wall Street, when you think of Wall Street, you think of wealth. Of course, Wall Street is wealth, right? The stock market, Lehman Brothers, J.P. Morgan, all those big names, they had their start in slavery. They had their start as slave traders, as slaveholders, and even many of them were in New York. They financed the southern, different facets of the southern economy. Cotton production, railroad building throughout the South. Some of the first items on the New York Stock Exchange or the Wall Street Stock Exchange were human beings, were our ancestors. So the wealth that was produced by this institution is still with us today. And one of the issues that both our gentlemen, Malcolm X and Dr. King, talked about is the economic injustice. And I was reading up again for this talk, and they're saying it's wonderful to have equality, But you cannot have true equality without economic justice, because they're looking at the legacy and the impact of hundreds of years of one group of people having and another group of people not having. It's if you are the child of, say, I'm just going to call a random name, Mr. Ball of South Carolina, let's say, who owned hundreds of slaves. And slavery ended, but Mr. Ball has left for each of his sons a trust fund of £50,000 or dollars. And these sons and daughters can go on and, buy property, travel to Europe, send their children to school. The slaves of Mr. Ball, let's say 3 black boys, and it said to them, okay, you're free now. And indeed they are, but what do they have? So one of the crimes for me of emancipation, wherever emancipation was, whether it was in the British Empire, whether it was in the United States or Brazil, is that the whites were given something. In the British Empire, they got £20 million compensation, but the former property received nothing. And then they were expected to go ahead and build a life and be successful. We are still living with this economic disparity to this day, because the children of the slaves of Mr. Ball, they had to go out. They had to work again like slaves. In fact, many of them were re-enslaved through sharecropping. And that happened here in Nova Scotia. We saw when the Loyalists came home, so many of them became sharecroppers just to survive, and the kidnapping and capture of people here and sending them down to the West Indies, selling them into slavery or the American South. That was it was more common than people thought. Some of you may have seen the series, The Book of Negroes, where some of these issues were brought to the fore. But many freed black loyalists who came to Nova Scotia actually found themselves re-enslaved in the West Indies. There's a case that I'm working on of 4 black people in Shelburne who, they were free, they were black loyalists, and they were kidnapped, spirited away from Shelburne, put on the water, sailed up to Halifax. The kidnappers sailed them up to Halifax, and they were going to be sold south again. Fortunately, they were able to bust free and alerted sympathetic people, and it went to court, and the judge said they were free. Nothing happened to the kidnappers, but they were redeemed. Many, many, many were not redeemed. So these are hard stories. As the teachers were saying, they don't want to tell their white students this, but I said, hard stories for whom? Hard stories for whom? And we're still living with the economic disparities to this day. The unemployment rate among black people, the high incarceration rates, because there are no jobs. And again, I was reading some of Dr. King's letters last night, and one of the letters he wrote to his wife when he was in Coretta, when he was in Birmingham jail, and he said something to the effect about, because as you know, later on, he was very much engaged in the Poor People's Campaign, and he talked about this fact of employment or unemployment. And he linked it to racism. He said these are some of the issues we're grappling with, racism and unemployment, and he went on and on. So this poem is about a woman, and she was pregnant, as women sometimes are, and she ran away from slavery, but she was caught, and her punishment was 100 lashes. She, of course, dies. And there was another woman in a plantation in Jamaica who said, well, she's dead, but, she's like very pregnant. Let's try and save the child. So I linked the midwife woman to Queen Nanny of Jamaican Maroons, who was also a midwife herself and a leader. So Nanny of the Jamaican Maroons was a leader. She was a chieftainess, she was a midwife, and she was a military strategist. And she fought the British 4 years and emerged a winner. And a niece of Granny Nanny, and a Khan woman, a woman who can see far, a woman with the knowledge of herbs. Pretty much like Mrs. Crawley, her name is, midwife, knowledge of herbs, a woman who worked in the field cutting cane, a woman who speaks the language of her grandmothers, a woman who tells stories of magical animals and of fabled cities beneath mighty rivers, a woman who was stolen from her village when she was 14, a woman who was raped on the slave ship by sailors, a woman who flies to Africa when she sleeps. This woman, this niece of Granny Nanny, takes her cutlass and runs with the swiftness of Sogalon Conde. This woman runs with her machete, an ancient chant rising from her throat, an ancient chant imploring God to attend this woman in childbirth. She calls her companions, form a circle around the dead woman, breathe, give her breath, give her life, help her birth this child. This woman, this niece of Granny Nanny, enters the circle with her cutlass, the ancient chant leaping from her lips, cuts open the belly of the dead woman and releases the child, and she says, "Oh, praises to our God, the child is alive. Oh, Onyame, take the spirit of the mother." Praises, praises, praises. In the midst of misery and pain, in the midst of our humiliation and grief, in the midst of this inhumanity, the child lives. Our world is turned upside down. Day becomes night, and night becomes day, and the dead is giving birth to the living. This woman, this niece of Granny Nanny, this ancient midwife, dances with the child, backward, sideward, forward, dances, spins and joins her companions, dancing like the priestess she would have been had not slavery stolen her away from her people. The woman dances with the child, holds the child up to the sky. Blessings, she said, blessings, blessings, blessings. Oh, praises to God. Oh, Onyame, which is the word for God in the Akan language. Oh, Onyame, take the spirit of the mother. Praises, 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 because the child is alive. Woy, woy, woy. The child lives. Thank you. So it is a hard story, but you need to tell that to each other and to your children. Because when I hear that story, I know I can go on. It gives me strength, and I know it's my responsibility to know to make sure that Nanny's memory doesn't fade away, or memory of her, or when I'm driving by or walking by a plantation, and you see the beautiful house and whatever else is there, that who built and who created that. We built the wealth of the Americas. We built the wealth from Canada right down to Argentina. And we should know that. Last week, February 16th, was Heritage Day. And the person that we honored in Nova Scotia for Heritage Day was Viola Desmond. She won't be honored next year because the province has a strange thing of every February, they're gonna honor a new person. And I'm thinking, well, we should all have gotten together and the man that permanently, forever, is named Viola Desmond. It can still happen, I think. And she was one of our leaders, and it's taken now, I think she was pardoned in 2010, I believe. This time came out a year later. There's a display about her at the Canadian Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg. So it's taken a good chunk of time, 40, 50 years, for her to be recognized. And it's incumbent. And you know, Vi was a leader before November 8th, 1946. You know, she was a leader in the world of entrepreneurship, in business, and in beauty. I say to people, nowadays we go to the spa, we go get a facial, pedicure, manicure, whatever people go to do. And so the spa is a popular thing right now. But she had that in the 40s. She had that as a very young woman. She made her own wigs. She had a factory where she made her own wigs. And her sister Wanda Robson said she one day used to work at the factory. She made her own cosmetics, her own body cream, her own makeup. Just incredible. And we know her because she refused to sit in the so-called colored section on November 8, 1946 in New Glasgow. But she was such a leader already in the Nova Scotia community. She also had trained people, young women, I should say, and they would go out, but were kind of like disciples, because they would go out into the province and set up their own beauty shop. And they would use her products and her wigs and so on. Just an incredible story. And then, of course, her husband was across the street from her, and he had his barber shop. So between the two of them, they run things in Halifax. So she was already known, a leader, and made money. Her sister, Wanda, I was speaking to Wanda Robson a couple of years ago, and she said, when Viola Desmond died at the age of 50, very, very young, she left thousands of dollars for her nieces and nephews. She herself didn't have any children. She bought and sold real estate. So she accumulated wealth. I think had she been able to stay, she and her husband, in Halifax, they would have been a real powerhouse in this province. But they left. They left because of racism. They left because they were fearful. Because Viola Desmond took her case, as you know, to the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, and she lost. And I think after she lost, it discouraged her, and she and her husband moved to Boston. But she was coming from a long tradition of people, of women in her case, who got into the black community and used the resources of the community for the benefit of the community. She herself, when she wanted to train as a beautician, she could not in Halifax because no beauty school would admit black girls to their program. So she had to leave Halifax. She went to Montreal, and then after Montreal, she went to New York City and trained at one of Madame C.J. Walker's beauty college, the one in New York. And Madame C.J. Walker, of course, was this, again, brilliant woman, brilliant entrepreneur. They said she was the first self-made female millionaire in the United States. Self-made is the operative word here, because you had many white women who were millionaires, but through their husbands and their fathers. Madame C.J. made herself, through her own business enterprises, a millionaire. And she set up beauty colleges across the the country. But not just across the country, as I came to realize. When I say the country, I mean the United States. She also set up beauty colleges in Jamaica, where I'm from. I was in talking to, not necessarily to older people, but people who knew the history, who said to me, well, Madame had a, C.J. Walker that is, had a college in Kingston, Jamaica, and trained Jamaican people who later on went out, like Viola Desmond, and set up their own beauty shops. Just incredible. So Viola Desmond built on that. She trained at one of Madame's schools in New York City, and she came back to Nova Scotia and set up her own beauty school, because she also had a beauty school, and young women graduated from her school. So you saw, I hope, maybe you, some of these pictures are on Google, you can look at them. There's a graduating class of her with her students, and they're in this black uniform, and she, you know, they have the certificates that they get from her school. But all that was cut short when she was thrown out of the cinema in New Glasgow in Nova Scotia. And we know her trials and travails with the justice system. And I thought, if that woman and her husband had remained in Nova Scotia, I'm sure as a community we would have been further ahead. I'm sure of that. But she had to leave. Because someone said, okay, so she lost the case, but you know, she and her husband and members of her family received death threats even after she lost the case at the Supreme Court. They were afraid that they would burn them out, because that's what happened, right? Burn down people's place at night. They received death threats. They were afraid, and she left. And so it's critical that we remember her and her struggles. And we need a good biography. We need a biography of Viola Desmond, and couch it within the framework of the time and her leadership roles. The November 8th, 1946, it was right after the war. It was a year after the war, the Second World War ended in Europe. And I think she was not the first person, you know, who got thrown out of the cinema or who stood up. Carrie Best also had a similar experience in the same New Glasgow. But I think why this case was so hot, or why Viola Desmond decided to pursue it to the bitter end, was because of that fact. It was right after the war. And people are saying, look, African Canadians, African Americans, men and women were in Europe fighting Hitler, fighting fascism and Nazism, making the world, making Europe safe, and we come back and in our own country, and we can't even sit in the cinema, we have to sit in a segregated spot. And so the war was really a turning point in the whole civil rights movement in both Canada and the United States. Because people are saying, it's not Hitler or the Germans who are doing this to me in Canada. It's my neighbor. It's the regular Anglo-Saxon, Scottish, English, Irish people who are doing this to me, not the Germans. You know, there we are in Europe fighting them, and we come over here and we don't even have basic rights. People, returning veterans from the war in America and Canada, colored veterans or black veterans, many of them could not march in the veterans parade down Main Street or whichever street they were marching on. They couldn't. The black veterans could not march. The white veterans did not want to march with them in our country of Canada. So you find after the war, the civil rights movement really heating up, because people are saying, no more, no more, no more. We're not gonna tolerate this kind of treatment in our country. We have, and so oftentimes when we hear the Viola story, many people will say, yes, November 8, 1946, that was 9 years before Rosa Parks, that this woman made her stand. Because oftentimes as Canadians, we don't know, are not very familiar with the Canadian story of the civil rights movement. And Rosa Parks, as you know, was arrested, the Montgomery bus boycott, she refused to give up her seat. But 9 years earlier, this woman in New Glasgow, this woman from Halifax, also refused to give up her seat, right? And if we jump ahead, same 1955, in Ontario, we think of another leader, Bromley Armstrong. And Bromley Armstrong did great works in Ontario. There was an association called National Unity Association, which was composed of African Canadian people in Ontario, because Ontario, like many other places in Canada, was a segregated society. Black people couldn't eat in certain restaurants, couldn't go to certain cinemas, couldn't. One woman named Barbara Carter from Dresden, Ontario, she told me, she said, Afua, when we were kids, we couldn't go to the local ice cream shop. You couldn't go there. You could buy an ice cream, but you'd have to buy it through a window. You couldn't go into the ice cream parlor and sit and eat your ice cream. And Bromley Armstrong was one of the people who went down to, along with Hugh Burnett, who went down to Dresden, Ontario. Again, Dresden kind of started its life as a black town, so it's interesting how over the course of 100 years it shifted. And they went down to Dresden and sat in a restaurant, and they were refused service. And the reason they did that was, in 1955, the Ontario government had passed the Fair Accommodations Act and the Fair Employment Act. And the Fair Accommodations Act basically meant that you could go anywhere, you could go to any hotel, rent a room, go eat in the restaurant, whatever. But even though this was no law, 1955, in Ontario, many shopkeepers and restaurant owners and so on were still practicing discrimination. So Bromley Armstrong and others went down to Dresden to test, because they knew that in this, it's not that Dresden was the only one that was obeying the law. No one was obeying the law, but Dresden was a test case. And of course they were refused service and they were cast out of the restaurant, and it made national news, right? It made national news that this was happening. And people like Hugh Burnett, who is from Dresden, or was from Dresden, born a son of Dresden, his ancestors were Underground Railroad people. After the agitation from the National Unity Association, he couldn't find work. Hugh Burnett was a carpenter, and after this 1955 Fair Employment Act and their activism in the region, his business dried up. No one patronized him anymore. His income went from many $1,000s a year to something like $200 a year. Affected his marriage. I think his marriage broke up. He had to move from Dresden to Windsor, Ontario, where he was able to find work in the auto industry. So, this is important because so many people sacrifice so much for all of us. One of the mothers of the 4 little girls who got killed in the church in Birmingham in 1963, we know Spike Lee made a film called 4 Little Girls, because it was the heyday of the civil rights movement, and the Ku Klux Klan went and bombed the church. Imagine we're sitting here today in church, and this church is bombed, right? And many people were injured, of course, but 4 little girls died. And one of the mothers of one of the girls, the mom said, You know, I was not involved in the civil rights movement. I kept my head straight. I just didn't want to be involved in the marches. My life was good. I had a nice family. I had a nice husband. I had a nice house. I was not going to get involved. And she said that my daughter shamed me, one of the girls who died, because she said, she came home one day and she said, "Mom, I want to go march." And her mom said, "No, you can't go march. You're too young." And she said, "No, there are kids my age on the sidewalk marching." And her mom said, "No, you're too young, you can't go and march." And then she turned to her mom and said, "But you're not too young." And she said, "I was shamed because my own daughter," but even though her daughter shamed her, she still didn't go on march. The point of this is, when her daughter was killed, she realized that she had to go march. She had to join the movement because people were being sacrificed for it. So and oftentimes we do that, don't we? We say, "I don't want to involve with those blacks, they're too radical." When we send our children to school, we tell them, "Don't join the Black Student Organization, because they have petitions to the president, and I don't want you involved in that." That's what we tell our kids, and that's what we tell ourselves. At the same time, when those people demonstrate or die or whatever else, benefits are that the society usually opens up, and then everybody rushes in and gains from this opening up. So we don't want to do the work, we don't want to do the struggle, but we want to enjoy the fruits of the struggle, right? And without struggle, there is really no progress. As it's not an original quote, I think it's Paul Robeson who said it. Without struggle, there is no progress. And so when we reflect on the sacrifices that the leaders and the rank and file and the 4 little girls and Emmett Till and all those people Viola Desmond made, then we have to be ashamed of ourselves, right? Because if it snows too hard, we don't even want to leave our house. Or if we have to walk to the bus stop, we say, "Oh, it's 1 mile, I can't walk." People were walking like 20 miles or something. So, we remember those leaders, Hugh Burnett and Bromley Armstrong and Viola Desmond and so many, lots and lots of other people. Carrie Best in this province, who ran a newspaper called The Clarion. And in fact, the Clarion newspaper, it gave you a different version of the Viola Desmond case from what you'd be reading in mainstream paper, right? And so I want to see people coming up. I want to see people coming up and writing books on these stories and doing research on Carrie Best and Viola Desmond, and putting it out there so that we know. Carrie Best ran a newspaper in this province called The Clarion, an important newspaper. Why don't we know more about it? We want to have a biography of Richard Preston. And maybe this is a task of this church, to commission such a work. To send one of your students or someone else to Acadia University Archives to do the research on Preston and to send people to Virginia. Because a lot of what we know about Richard Preston is kind of hearsay, we're not sure, that kind of thing. And why don't we know Richard Preston was such a hugely influential figure in Nova Scotia and in the black world in general? He founded churches. Imagine this person coming from Virginia looking for his mother. He found her and then went on to establish all these churches. His Preston Church being one of the churches that was established by Richard Preston. We have to valorize our leaders and do the research on them so that we know, and the people coming in the future will know. We don't want people to come and say, well, Richard Preston didn't do anything. All he did was, maybe he founded Cornwallis Street Baptist Church, which was called the African Chapel at the time. That he went to England and was ordained as a minister and came back and engaged in religious leadership and in civil rights leadership. He was one of the founders of the Abolition Society in Halifax. Why the Abolition Society? Because slavery had been abolished in Nova Scotia and the British Empire, but it was still going on in the United States. And Richard Preston and his associates founded the Abolition Society to agitate for the end of slavery in America, but also to lend support to fugitives from American slavery. And yes, there were many fugitives, many Underground Railroad people who came to Halifax and Nova Scotia. When William and Ellen Craft escaped from Macon, Georgia, they wrote a book called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. Ellen Craft looked white. She was a slave. She talks about her hair being the color of corn silk, meaning she had blonde hair, and her eyes green. She was her master's daughter, and she was a slave. And she married a man named William Craft, and he, in terms of complexion, he was the opposite of her. He was very dark, but when you say very dark, in comparison to what? You know, we kind of have to stop using these descriptions. But anyway, we can say that for now. And she and William Craft, they came up with this plan. Now, running for freedom from the Deep South is hard. You're not in Maryland. You're not in Kentucky. If you're in Kentucky, you cross over the Afua River. Not as easy as making it sound, but it means you don't have that far to go. If you're coming from Georgia, you have far to go. And William, her husband, who was a skilled craftsman, they came up with this plan, which I think is the most brilliant plan on the planet, that she would disguise herself as a young white male. And William, her husband, bought her the suit and the top hat and the tie, and she became a man. And he, William, would be his or her servant, slave. And the idea was that she would be traveling from Georgia to Philadelphia for medical treatment, because the rules was that she was sick, and you go north because there are better doctors there. And her hand was in a sling. Why was her hand in a sling? Because she couldn't read or write, and if she's posing as a free white man, it could mean that at some point she would be asked to sign something. So her hand was in a sling. She wouldn't have to sign anything. And they traveled first class on the train. Ellen Craft as a young white male, disguised as a man, and William Craft, her husband, as her slave servant. And they traveled first class to Philadelphia. And then they were able to come out, because Philadelphia is in the free north. And then from there, they heard slave catchers were after them, so they went to Boston. And even in Boston, they weren't safe. So they said, well, let's go to British soil. They came up to Halifax and wrote their book, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. And Ellen and William Craft said, in Halifax, we found the same mean Yankee prejudice. I mean, they're Americans, so that's their frame of reference, Yankee, but they could have said, this is Canadian prejudice. It kind of really had nothing to do with the Yankees. And they faced a lot of discrimination here, a lot in Halifax, so they decided to leave again, to run again. and they sailed across the ocean to Liverpool, England, where they stayed and had their children. They had 5 kids, and came back to the United States after the Civil War. But they said in their book that when they arrived in Halifax, they arrived with 14 other Underground Railroad travelers, whose name we don't know. So Richard Preston would have known the crafts. The Halifax Abolition Society perhaps supported and helped the crafts during the time they were in Halifax. Richard Preston was, to me, I don't know, just this brilliant person. And this is, if you imagine someone like Richard Preston coming out of slavery, because he did come out of slavery, the kind of genius that was in bondage. Richard Preston, William Craft, Ellen Craft, and others, the kind of genius that was in bondage. The oppressors know that these people were geniuses. Oftentimes, the report that we get, or the idea that we have of slavery, is that enslaved people were these unskilled people who their only task was to just go work in the field and chop down a tree and pick on or cut sugar cane. No. Slave hunters deliberately hunted Africans in certain locales. Like if you were in Gambia, they knew you had the knowledge of rice growing. If you're in Gambia or Sierra Leone. And it was the skills of enslaved Africans that developed a rice industry in the Carolinas and Georgia. Black people were growing rice that made the planters wealthy. And many Nova Scotians actually traced their descent to people from coastal Georgia and the Carolinas. So they had these skills. Miners, people who were mining in gold and silver. So the gold mines of Brazil and the silver mines of Peru were worked by African slaves because they were doing these kinds of mining work in Africa. When you go down to Louisiana and look at some of the mansions and the townhouses, they were called, with the beautiful, crafts work, the filigree work, the pewter, the copper, all done by enslaved people. And then they'll tell you, they said, oh, the masters built these houses. No, they did not. It was their slaves that built these houses. So slave masters knew the genius that these people had. Whether it was in art and craft, whether it was in, horticultural skills. The Kentucky Derby, those of you who are interested, and you don't have to be interested in racehorsing to know, the Kentucky Derby is a major event on the planet. Everybody knows about it. The first winners, jockeys, were slaves. And even when slavery ended, black men kept dominating the derby. They were winning all the time, right? During slavery, their owners would pocket the winnings and maybe give them something. So in every area of life, and we see it today, right up to today, the genius, the skills, the talents that the descendants of these enslaved people have. You look at the sporting world, the music world, which are those two arenas they have let us in traditionally, and which we have dominated. Unfortunately, when you look at the owners of the sporting teams and the music companies, they are not black people. So I want to look briefly now on our two men, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Why is Malcolm X important? Because we have a lot of myths about Malcolm X. But he was born Malcolm Little on May 25th, 1925. His parents were Earl Little and his dad, and his mom was Louisa Norton. And his mom was from the West Indian island of Grenada. And Earl was from Georgia, his father. We know that his father, Earl was a Garveyite. Earl was a disciple of Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey had founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. And Earl traveled around in several states preaching Marcus Garvey's philosophy of black self-help. Marcus Garvey was about collective security and independence for African people. And so Earl would go about preaching Garvey's philosophy. Some people say he was a Baptist minister. We're not quite sure. One of his children said he was, one said he wasn't, but that the Baptist preachers would allow him to use the pulpit to talk about UNIA. Whether or not he could have been, not an ordained minister, we know we have that tradition in our community. Many people are not necessarily ordained, but they preach. So he was in that tradition. We know Malcolm X's mother embraced what's called heterodox Christianity, meaning she went to different denominations. She wasn't a member of anyone. And her children remember that the last denomination she took them was to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because she had become the mother, a vegan, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church had these dietary principles which she found attractive. So before she was carted off to the mental health institution, because the Ku Klux Klan killed Malcolm X's dad, and the family kind of disintegrated after that, she always told her kids when they were coming to take them to the foster care that they shouldn't eat pork. So, or pork products. We know of the trajectory of Malcolm X, his life from prison. He was a brilliant, again, another genius person. Malcolm X in Michigan was the only black kid in his class. He ended up becoming the class president, because we're told he had great speaking skills. He was a natural leader. So even though they were more or less in a white environment, he took leadership of his class. But nonetheless, with the murder of his dad and his mother being taken to the mental institution, the family fell apart. He got into criminal activities. He was imprisoned. While he was in prison in Massachusetts, he came upon Elijah Muhammad, who at that time had founded the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm X began changing his life in prison. We know that Malcolm X read the dictionary in prison. And we don't want people to be going to prison so that they can read in books for the first time, right? Nonetheless, it's great that the prison that he was in had a library, and the prisoners had access to the library, and he read everything you can think of: Shakespeare, Chaucer, the books of W.E.B. Du Bois. Unfortunately, in Canada today, even some of those a basic thing like a library that used to be in the prisons are being cut. Many of the prisoners today don't even have that, what is probably a luxury. But his religiosity was much more complex. It was in prison that he started calling himself Malachi Shabazz, or Malik Shabazz, as he came to be known. He became a kind of modest prisoner. He read, he spoke, so much so that his 10-year prison term was cut short to 6, and he was able to leave prison in 1952. I'm going to fast forward. Upon leaving prison, he went to Detroit, where Elijah Muhammad appointed him assistant minister to the Detroit Temple. He was such a great orator and organizer that he was promoted to the New York Temple number 7. And it is in New York that we see Malcolm coming into playing this role as a great leader. We also know that he broke eventually with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and then embraced Orthodox Islam or Sunni Islam. In 1964, he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is a requirement of every Muslim if you can afford it. There's a background to all of this though. It was not as if Malcolm was out there by himself doing his own thing. When he was in prison, and this is an important point, his siblings never deserted him. His sisters, his brothers, they visited him, and it was they who first joined the nation. And it was one of his brothers, Wilbert, who came and started telling him about the Nation of Islam. And his sister, his oldest sister, Ella, who is the sister of his father from a previous relationship, who really helped him and went to bat for him and supported him when he came out of prison. So if there's a lesson in this, and which we all know, is that even when people are inside, perhaps that's when they need help more than any other time. And Malcolm X went to Mecca and traveled to Africa and fell in love with the African world. In between 1963 to 65, we find him spending a lot of time in Africa, meeting with the leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal, the Nigerian president, and so on, and linking the struggles of African-American people to the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. In 1964, when he came back to the United States, he said, we should stop calling ourselves Negroes because we're Africans, he said. That's what we are, Africans. And he started the organization of Afro-American Unity, which he patterned after the Organization of African Unity in Africa. He was invited by the African Summit in Egypt to come and represent his organization. Malcolm X had become this international statesman, a great lover of Africa, and was also charging the United States with genocide. Just before he was assassinated, he was set to present a case against the United States at the United Nations, charging the United States with racism against African American people. He died, he was assassinated. Ossie Davis gave the eulogy, called him our black shining prince, the embodiment of our manhood. A beautiful eulogy. If you have time, you should read it. It's actually up online. Another important point in this man's life is that oftentimes we see him and King as polar opposites. You know, Malcolm X is talking about self-defense, King is talking about non-violence. Not really true. Towards the end of their lives, they were coming closer and closer together in terms of philosophy. When Dr. King was assassinated, exactly 1 year before assassinated, he spoke at the Riverside Church in New York, this speech called Beyond Vietnam. Right? We know of his speech 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, but he didn't stop there. It's as if King is frozen in time in 1963. He kept going, he kept developing as a leader and as an individual. And in 1967, he gave the speech Beyond Vietnam, which many people said was his death sentence. Because in the Beyond Vietnam speech, he charged again the United States with committing murder on little brown children in Vietnam, he said. He linked the struggle he said, how can you be spending so much money in Vietnam, beefing up the military, when poor and black people at home are starving and have no jobs? And he indicted capitalism, so he linked the struggle between the various struggles, what was happening at home, unemployment, racism, with what was happening around the world, in this case, in Vietnam. And many people said that was really his death sentence, that speech. So he was coming closer and closer to positions that Malcolm X had articulated earlier. And whereas Malcolm X, before his death, had joined a mainstream civil rights movement. And both men were meeting behind the scenes, and they were even planning of combining their platforms. So these are some of the things that we need to know about our leaders. And it's important that we take care of our leaders. I'm making an appeal for you. Take care of our leaders and their families. How many people saw the film Selma? Yes, good. We all say it's a great film, wonderful film. But one of the things we know, that when Dr. King was assassinated, and these people had no money, they were poor. It's a struggle. They struggled. They gave of themselves and their lives and their families. And we saw when Dr. King, when they asked him to turn back the struggle, not to engage, and tell me when my time is up, it's probably up, in the struggle anymore. And he said, no, I'm going to continue to lead the people. We saw J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of CIA, said, well, this guy, we can't get him to turn back, but let's cause some dissent in his family. Let's work on his family. Let's help to break down the family. This is real people. They do this. They will come in and set two brothers against each other.
And sisters.
And sisters, yes. They do this. Let's cause some dissent. We know he's on the road all the time, preaching and marching. His wife is at home with herself, with a kid. Let's push them even further apart. It is a strategy. J. Edgar Hoover had a strategy for black people and for black leaders. He said, what, you neutralize them, you assassinate them, and there's a third thing. Can't remember.
Jim Crow, take their minds, take their... Something to do with the mind.
Yeah, or something to do with the mind, right? So there were three things he said you do to turn back the struggle. And Coretta was left with the kids, and they had no money. And people like Harry Belafonte, who were friends of the Kings and of the movement, before Dr. King died, he took out a life insurance. Dr. King did not have a life insurance policy. And this is what our men need to know, that you must get life insurance policies for your families, and women too. And so when he died, Coretta was able to cash that check. There's another thing, and I'll be done, is that, we see the singers and the actors, and we don't know what they're doing behind the scene. During the struggle, the civil rights movement in America, the actors, Ossie Davis, Say It Loud and Black and Proud, James Brown, all those people, because I had the opportunity to speak to Harry Belafonte in London, and he said they would arrest the leaders, and the singers and the actors would go downtown and bail them out, because they had the money. So there was, they might be singing on stage, singing whatever, but their minds are still on the movement. When Malcolm X was assassinated, same thing. He didn't own the house he lived in. He had 6 kids by now, because the twins died after he was born. That was 6 children. His wife didn't have anything. Children didn't have anything. And it was a community. The community that came together and literally passed around the hat and got money for that family. So we need to take care of each other, take care of our leaders, and we have to remember them all. If I'm going to leave you with one point, is this, that we, all of us, are leaders in our own right. Each one of us has a special gift, and some people are lucky, they have gifts, plural, right? And and support of other people, we can actualize this gift. We can make it whatever it is that we were brought in the world to do. We can make it happen. We can step into our own light and into our own brilliance. And we have that. So each one of us inside has a leader. And it's important that we actualize this leadership. Here's why. Because at some point or another, people may get assassinated. The man or the woman in front waving the banner is going to be cut down. And usually when that happens, the struggle falls apart. But if each one of us is able to activate our own inner leadership, then we will keep going. We will keep going. We will keep going. And that's the message I want to leave you with. Thank you for your indulgence.